Okay, we have now 176 guests. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, just to remind you again that our session is in English. We have the Arabic translation that Osama just explained. We want to welcome you on behalf of UNDP to all the participants of this webinar and to our distinguished panel members. My name is Naja Hashimi. I'm the Electoral Policy Specialist with UNDP's Regional Office for the Arab States. I am based in Amman. I'm your moderator for this webinar on the impact of COVID on elections. I hope you're all well, staying healthy in your homes. We all know the devastating impact COVID-19 is having on public health, on the economy. It is limiting our movement and changing what we have come to know as normal life. But it is also affecting one of our fundamental rights, our right to elect our representatives, our right to vote and take part in elections. As governments focus on public safety in their response to the crisis, electoral authorities across the globe are grappling with decisions on how to respond. Should elections be postponed? Should elections go forward as scheduled? What measures are needed if elections are to take place? These are not easy decisions. As you will hear from the panel today, these decisions are highly complex with implications not only for elections and election day, but for the overall political stability and the state of democracy of a country. To discuss these issues, we have an excellent and high-level panel of electoral authorities and experts who will share their experience and knowledge on the implications of the pandemic on elections in general, the technical challenges it has created for them as EMBs, and what opportunities it presents for the election community, which is all of us, to not only operate in this new normal, but to come out of it stronger and better. As I can see from the number of participants attending today, these topics are on the minds of many of us. These are important issues that need to be discussed and debated, and UNDP is happy to provide this platform to do so today. We plan to bring these webinars to you every 2 weeks for the time being. Future sessions, we hope, will be thematic focused, and we seek your ideas, suggestions for topics of interest to you and your partners. We know there's a lot of interest on the options for distance voting, postal voting, and other ways that EMBs can ensure elections take place in a safe and secure manner. We promise future webinars will be available in additional languages. Now let's take this opportunity to have a stimulating interactive conversation on how to ensure our individual and collective response to COVID-19 and how we can take into account the public's fundamental right to elect their representatives without risking their health and safety. We welcome and encourage all of you to take an active part in these discussions by sharing your comments, questions, suggestions in the chat box. Before I hand over to our panel members, I will go through a few housekeeping issues. The agenda is the introduction that I've just provided the speakers as they do the presentation. Each of the speakers will have 10 minutes. We will also have a question and answer session after all the speakers have spoken. But in the meantime, I do ask that you share your comments, your questions in the chat box. I will be monitoring the conversation and jumping in if needed. But please, the actual Q&A will be after the speakers. The link of this session will be available. The session can be accessed afterwards offline. Please feel free to share it with colleagues who may have not been able to attend. I'm going to ask one more time because we've had new guests since Osama did his update on the translation. Osama, can you do that one more time? Osama? Okay, Osama,
Yes, Naji, I'm here.
Can you explain one more time the Arabic translation? We have new guests.
مرة ثانية للأشخاص اللي بيحبوا يسمعوا اللغة العربية، مثل ما حكينا قبل شوي لتفعيل اللغة العربية وسماع الترجمة، كونه هاي الندوة رح تكون باللغة الإنجليزية، لكن في عنا زميلتنا هدى بتعمل ترجمة من إنجليزي لعربي. زوم إلى الآن مش موفر بالمنيو تبعته اللغة العربية بشكل عام، لهيك حنستخدم القناة الفرنسية لسماع اللغة العربية. لهيك اضغط تحت في الأسفل رح تلاقي في لوحة، هاي اللوحة لونها أسود، في إشارة الكرة الأرضية اللي حالياً بأشر عليها بالماوس. اضغط عليها واختار فرنسي. لما تضغط على اللغة الفرنسية رح تكون قادر على سماع الترجمة باللغة العربية. اضغط أيضاً على ميوت أوريجينال أوديو أو كتم الصوت الأصلي لسماع المترجمة بشكل ممتاز فقط، وعدم سماع الشخص اللي بيتكلم حالياً بصوته الأصلي. Well, I'm done, Nadia.
Thank you so much, Osama. Okay, we will now not waste more time and move to the panel members, but first to tell you that this is our first webinar, so please bear with us. If we face any technical issues, be patient, we'll try to sort them out. Please again use the chat box to send us any messages, either privately to myself or Osama or to the group. Dear panel members, I'm honored and appreciate you have taken the time to join us today and share your experiences in what promises to be a stimulating webinar. I know each of you are in the midst of very challenging moments of history in your countries. All of us on this call value what you will share with us today. Dr. Rafael Lopez-Pintor, our first speaker. He's our resident guru on elections. We are so happy to have him here today. I know many of you know him. I know many of you have worked with him and respect him. Rafael will provide an overall context to this webinar. He will provide an analytical framework for understanding the effects of the pandemic on the elections in the broader political context. Rafael, again, thank you so much for taking time. You have 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Nadia. Good day to everybody. Ramadan Kareem for all those friends who are on Ramadan. And I'm going to try to provide some thoughts on what might be a general outline to assess the current situation in given country. So since we have very little time, I'll try to be very brief and just throw the key thoughts on this as I see this. So the main question would be, which are currently being and could be in the future, in the near future, the effects of the evolution of this pandemic of COVID-19 over the holding of elections, and vice versa, which effect might have the holding of elections in a given country on the evolution of the pandemic itself, as well as on the politics of the country. In order to try to provide an answer which would be adequate in a given country, I think that there are two main contextual dimensions or variables that we should take into account. One would be the state of democracy in the country, and the second one would be the economic status of the country, maybe because we are going through a recession. And so the state of democracy, we can distinguish well-established democracies, normally with the state apparatuses spread in the territory. Democracies in crisis, where we can identify mainly post-conflict situations where elections are supposed to be held, and transitional elections. And then what we could call electoral autocracies, which is quite a larger number of countries in the world these days. I mean that rather authoritarian governments, which came to the public authority by the polls, and then reproduce themselves and use the elections as validating government in a periodic manner. So we have these three general kind of statuses for democracy. And then the economic status of the country, we just can classify the countries in the three standard boxes: high economic development, medium, and low. And then we can place a given country. Once we have the given country placed in there, we can make an exercise of assessment, feasibility assessment, and viability assessment about the elections having held under conditions of the virus. So for the assessment, we go to risk, we go to cost, and anticipated effects. There are other variables, but I want to focus on these three: risk, cost, and anticipated effects. The risk arising from where? First of all, the evolutionary state of the pandemic. So we have cures. I will be back on it in a minute. In the second level will be the social conflict and turbulence arising from the economic recession, because already in some countries we're seeing this, and this might come as a factor affecting the entire political situation of the country, and certainly the elections. And purely, in the third place, we can mention the purely political conflicts in situation of post-conflict elections or transitional elections, or even in stable democracies, which would be the impact of having elections under the virus upon the whole political system. I mean, the institutional framework of the system. But I'll go back to the first point, the evolutionary state of the pandemic, because here it's important to notice that the curve, when they talk about the curve of the pandemic, we are talking of an empirical curve. It's not scientifically based. What I mean is that what we have in that curve in any country is they give us percentages. It is based on percentages of the dead as a percentage, I mean the dead as a percentage of the infected under test. And the infected under test are a percentage upon a base which you don't know how big it is. That base is the infected who are non-tested, either because they are just asymptomatic, or they are already sick, but they have not been tested and they are not recorded. And then we have another base of what might be a percentage of this later segment, which is the remaining vulnerable population. And then this is the largest part in any society. So what we have is this curve. This curve has some value, of course it has value, but we cannot fully rely on this data, because the data are taken and interpreted upon a base which is very limited. So really here we move in almost blindness, both medical practitioners and health researchers. And a third element on this, on the curve, is that the curve varies in the territories. So generally you get the national curve, but then there are regions, states, departments, provinces, where the situation of the pandemic, the evolutionary state of the pandemic, could be very different. So on this, we should have and on the second aspect of risk, social conflicts and unrest arising from the recession, I think this a lot will depend on the kind of welfare state that the country has, and on the social economic policies that government may issue to alleviate the situation of the poorer. And this is basically health policy, employment policy, and income policies, family income policies. About the cost, of course, these are about the risk. I'm going very fast because I want not to go beyond the 10 minutes. About the cost, it is certain that if we have elections under the COVID, we will incur in new and higher costs in certain aspects of the electoral processes. So we renewed procedures, mainly security cost, health protection cost. And then we can ask for the funding source. And the funding source is the national budget or the international community, both affected by a very deep and serious economic crisis. Concerning the third aspect of the viability assessment, I mentioned anticipated effects. Here I can distinguish three main areas of effects. One would be directly on the health condition of the population. And then here we go back to the curve. And then, okay, we have elections, we have to ask and try to respond to questions on whether under given conditions, holding elections in a given country, affecting the largest part of the adult population, if these might increase the risk for the health of how many people and in which regions of the country. A second effect, as important for the future of a country as the first one, or more, is on the quality of democracy. And here we have to distinguish at least three aspects. I would distinguish at least three aspects. The rights and freedoms. We already have rights and freedoms which have been curtailed because of the security in these difficult conditions, but we don't know how much those rights and freedoms which have been restricted will remain restricted, because something which often happens in situations of crisis is that rights and liberties are cut or diminished, and then they stay in the hands of governments. And this has to do with the concentrations of power in the executive branch of government. And a third effect on the quality of democracy should be on the cleavage, on the structure or the shape, how much the result of a given elections and the holding of the election itself will be affecting or might affect the shape of the main political cleavages and conflict lines. The cleavages, is the conflict lines in a given country. This is not only relevant for countries in transitional situation or post-conflict situations, it is also relevant in stable democracies, in the more stable democracies. We don't know how much the crisis under which we are going through is going to affect the quality of our democracy in the terms of the structure of the main conflict in society, the political cleavage. And this cleavage these days, universally, the main of these cleavages is the socioeconomic inequality. So we don't know after 2-3 years whether we will be more unequal than we are now, which we've been already running through much more inequality after the recession of 2008 and the following years. We don't know if still we will be more unequal, or contrarily, the kind of policies which might be decided and applied in the crisis situation might remain and make the society a bit more egalitarian. And finally, a third dimension where the conduct of the election might have an effect, and is the legitimacy and institutional strength of the electoral authority, of the EMBs, the electoral management bodies. And this, of course, we may think of situation where the body, the electoral administration, will come out of the crisis and the elections with institutionally reinforced and strengthened, or just the opposite, and weaken. And also the other effect might be on the working relations of the electoral administration and the other main powers of the state. I mean the executive branch and the legislative and the legislation. So with this would be my thoughts on designing a general outline or general framework for this. We know this election community, we are going through this like the medical practitioners and researchers. We are going by the week, which is not that bad. I mean, after all, we have a little bit longer distance from the situation. We can look at the situation from a bit more distance than politicians and governments, because politicians and government, they have to go by the day. And then not only by the day, they have to pretend, or very frequently, they pretend to have better information and more information than they actually do. But after all, they have the responsibility of row the boat through these turbulent waters. And we have to be also, understanding how difficult it is this day also to run over the society. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'll be very glad to share then the discussion with the other panelists and the audience. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rafael. It's a nice introduction and a sort of overview of how we see the effects. We know that they're affecting democracies across the board, whether they are stable, long-term stable democracies, whether they're new democracies. We are really in new uncharted territories. Please feel free to share your comments, your questions in the chat box. Our next presenter is Hisham Kuhail. He's the current CEO of the Election Commission of Palestine. He's leading the commission to many awards for professionalism and excellence in election administration. He has one of the strongest election commissions in the region. He's a two-term executive board member of the Organization of Arab Electoral Management Bodies. This association was established in 2015. It has 12 members from the Arab region. It's essentially an EMB association. Hisham is also the current chair of the executive board. He will provide context to how the pandemic is affecting elections in the region and the EMBs. He has recently, through the association, undertaken a survey of their members to see how they are coping with the effects of the pandemic. And he will share these findings with us for the first time today. Thank you, Hisham.
Oops. Yeah. Thank you, Najia. I'm glad to be here with you today. My intervention would be about briefing you with the main finding of the questionnaire or study, preliminary study that was taken by Arab EMB's organization to look at experiences, procedures, alternatives adopted by other electoral bodies in the region. So we formulate a sort of quick initial questionnaire to examine these measures and practices. And we got an initial reply from 10 participating countries. Of course, as Najia mentioned, we are 12 members within the organization, but we circulated the questionnaire to other non-members as well. And we hope to complete or conclude the final finding of that study in the coming days or weeks. So again, 10 countries participated and responded to our study. These are Yemen, Jordan, Somalia, Libya, Tunisia, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, Sudan, and Mauritania. So again, we wanted to identify the measure taken by this electoral management body during the sudden pandemic, that we all facing. We wanted to look at the alternatives adopted by them, so we can share it as sort of experiences to other electoral management body on how they are coping or how they can serve their audience in terms of stakeholders. Apparently, we all caught by surprise with this pandemic. Nobody was expecting this. Ranging from the top IT advanced, setups in the electoral management body to the lowest in terms of capacity and ability and equipment and progress. 80%, when we measure the effect, the direct effect on the pandemic on the electoral management body, 80% of the respondents or the 8 countries responded that it was a direct effect for the management bodies to provide their services. When we ask them, for example, on terms of the capacity, how they work in terms of their capacity, 6 responded with low capacity and 4 with medium capacity medium capacity. And of course, between medium and low, you can see all that we all have been affected by this pandemic. In terms of elections, we asked them whether you have elections scheduled this year. Out of the 10, 3 they were having scheduled election this year. And then we asked them, what do you do? What you are planning to do with them? And 1 responded that they have canceled the operation this year, and the other 2, they have not reached a decision on that. So they are thinking about whether to cancel it. And this is why we have to focus on the next seminars that we have to talk, that we don't want democracy to be affected within the sort of getting an easy answer by hiding without that the pandemic by taking the simple answer, let's postpone, let's stop, because nobody knows until this moment when we are going to go through this crisis. So 1 responded when we asked again, if you decided, are you ready? I mean, are you setting sort of procedures or plans to face or to conduct election, to deliver election under the circumstances? They said yes, but they haven't elaborated on that more. So apparently they are working on it. And this is the case that we have to keep pushing other electoral body again to think seriously about what can be done if we have to preserve democracy under the I mentioned low to medium capacity in terms of details of that. Some electoral management bodies decided to cut short the days of the week. So we used 3 days, for example, had to choose the number of staffing because of the areas. I mean, if I take my case here in Ramallah, for example, which is 15 kilometers from Jerusalem, none of Jerusalem staff can attend to work. Or if you go up north, Nablus, again, people from Nablus are not allowed to come to Ramallah. Yesterday, the Prime Minister, in our case, has responded with some easing up the situation, but movement across cities are banned unless you have permit, and you cannot get permits, of course, for all staff. Neither to say that working hours are defined between 10 and 5. So again, this is an added problem for commuting between cities. So again, staffing, lowering staffing, partial shutdown. I mean, we had to take a decision, for example, 4 responded, I think, that they had shut down the district offices. We call the district offices, that is area offices, because usually this is the minimum number of staff that they preside there. So we, in our case, for example, we shut down the headquarters for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, nearly 3 weeks now, and we are planning to go back next week on certain or limited capacity that preserve minimum standard to keep staff healthy and not focusing them to any risks. So between full shutdown or partial shutdown, reduction of staff, reduction of working hours, especially in Arab countries now, next week I think is Ramadan, so hours already has been reduced in that month. So that is the situation. Then we wanted to inquire about if they use tools as an alternative. Do they communicate with each other? I mean, let me be quite frank with you. I mean, the questions, they said, yes, yeah, we have plans. But I mean, if you read between the lines, they are not solid plans. And I think we have to work more on that as organization, UNDP organization, to try to formulate sort of communication tools, efficient communication tools to enable Arab countries or Arab electoral management bodies in the Arab countries to use technology in a different way. Because when we asked about how do you communicate, the answer was very simple. Yes, we use email, we use some social media, and we use phones, which is the traditional sort of communication of work, of the workplace, of course. Some started to use the software that we are using now, Zoom, but to a limited extent. Some are asking their staff to work from home. I don't know what kind of work they can do from home if they don't go home, they don't go to their workplace. Again, 70% responded positively that yes, but again, the same tools, email, Skype, and some social media application. We asked them, are we happy? Are you happy with such tools? They said, we are not happy. I mean, but this is the thing that we have in our position. So if you are not happy, what do you want from your institution in terms of, IT upgrade or whatever, application upgrade? They all focus, or let me put it this way, they focus on specialized training on new tools, in new, other than Skype, social media and emails, even Zoom, because they wanted to communicate not only between themselves, but they want to communicate with the stakeholders. I mean, nobody, 0 or 1 maybe out of the 10 are communicating with the electoral election stakeholders, So, and this is very important. It's not communication. It's not only between staff and management or commission and management, but also you have to keep in contact with the electoral election stakeholders. So, and if the situation will, God forbid, will be worse, then how do you apply training online? So you need specialized tools, application, if we know about, and we need to train people on how to make that tool effective and not boring, because when you deliver face-to-face training is 100% different than online. How to make online training accessible and acceptable as well, and getting to the point. So this was one of the major recommendations of the study. Yesterday, within, UNDP, the executive office, and our website developer explored the idea of using a platform that is provided by the European Commission called EDGE, and how to adapt it to our needs. And we will be working on that to see whether this will be good, and we will share it with our member states. We asked them how the Arab UNDP, which is an organization, as Najia said, supported by its members as well as the main supporter on UNDP, what topics do you need to, for example, if you want to do online training? So some of the topics highlighted was conflict management, data capitalization, IT building, security, again, where we identify. Some talk about using electronic registration, and using IT-based voter awareness techniques to a limited extent touch on the, which I see is premature. I mean, way out as well but we might get there. I don't know. That depends on the situation and how it's developed. So finally, we ask them, what do you expect from the, do you feel like it's a good idea that the Arab organization is contacting you and keeping touch with you? And they all said, yes, we have to follow up first on the, we escaped that barely. Mauritania workshop last March. We came, I remember we came back here and the shutdown was second day. So everybody up on the output outcome of the, recommendation of that workshop. They recommended again to go ahead with the women network that we have started, as well as initiating the youth network that we were planning to launch it this year. They again proposed something to do with creating a platform within the Airbnb website to be as an open platform for discussing certain topic apart from the use of new technology that I have mentioned before. This is a nutshell, the main finding. Again, although it was, I think 10 days sort of.
أيام كنا نعمل فيها بجد، ولكننا سنستمر بدفع الدول الأخرى أو الدول المتبقية.
That is going on, things will be developed and experiences will be
Thank you so much, Hisham.
Shared. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hisham, for giving us the context of what's happening in the region. We're getting good comments. We have now over 190 people on the conversation. People are asking in listening. Rafael, they appreciate the assessment. There are questions in terms of the data source and how people can know whether policies are going in the right direction or not. There's some concern about state surveillance and what that can mean for political participation, particularly in the Arab region. People are asking, the pandemic is being seen as a health issue, which it is, but also it needs to be considered as political. And I think this is why we're here. This conversation alludes to that fact in particular, because we see the implications for management bodies and for democracies at large. So with that, I'm going to ask our next speaker to provide an overview of how things are in the United States. It's a year of elections in the US. As many of you may know, US has a very diversified electoral system set up, different procedures and variations in how electoral administrations are structured across the different states. As the director of the National Association of Electoral Bodies across the states in the US, Amy is the person to help demystify how election administration works in the US. We are really happy to have Amy with us today. Amy, if you could share some of the commonalities and differences in how state EMBs are approaching the pandemic. What are some of the good practices you can share with us and some lessons learned from this for this global audience? Thank you.
Sure. So first of all, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for having me today. I am the executive director of the National Association of State Election Directors, which is a nonpartisan professional membership association for state election directors. In 40 states, the Secretary of State is the chief election official. And in those 40 states, my member works for the Secretary of State. And then in the other 16 states and territories, including DC, where we'll hear from Alice Miller in a little bit, the NASED member is the chief election official in that jurisdiction. In the US, there is no sort of central electoral body the way there is in other countries. So we have 2 federal agencies who touch elections in some way. We have the Election Assistance Commission, which focuses on election administration, but they provide guidelines and best practices. It's not a regulatory body, and they don't administer elections. And then we have the Federal Election Commission, which handles campaign finance, and they do some regulation there. There are federal laws around election administration, a handful of federal laws, and then some constitutional amendments around elections and access to elections. But in general, election is administered at the state level or the territory level. So 50 states, DC, and the 5 US territories all have their own sort of regulatory structures for how they administer elections. Within those states and territories, there are also local election jurisdictions, and they're the ones who are running the actual election. They are, setting up voting locations, managing poll workers and election observers and things like that. And in the US, we have between 8,000 and 10,000 of those local election jurisdictions, depending on how you're counting and what kind of election. So we're a very decentralized election administration atmosphere. I'll say broadly, we all knew going into 2020 that this year was going to be very difficult for us from an election administration perspective. It's a presidential election year. We've spent the last 3.5, 4 years very, very focused on election security. And so this was going to be a big year for us no matter what. Obviously, COVID-19 has made 2020 difficult in a way that I'm sure no one on this call really saw coming, and certainly has made things more interesting for us. Given the focus on cybersecurity over the last several years, election officials in the US have become very focused on contingency planning and sort of going through the worst case scenarios, from cyber incidents to volcanoes erupting and snowstorms and things like that. And some states have actually included outbreaks in those previous contingency planning scenarios. Certainly now everyone is working through their outbreak contingency plans. Specifically as it pertains to COVID-19, we've seen many states moving dates of their primary elections, which are the elections that take place before November. Again, because the US is so decentralized, different states have differing abilities to move those elections. So in some states, the chief election official can move the election. In some states, the chief election official has to work with the governor to do so. In some states, only the governor can do it, or the legislature has to be involved, or the courts. And so one of the things that we've seen, especially in March, was states sort of figuring that out. Moving elections is a thing that certainly people in the election administration community know and have thought about, but few have actually ever had to do it. And so working through some of those logistics can be very challenging. One of the other things that was that played into how states moved their elections and when they moved them to is that because this is a presidential election year, the political parties play a role. A lot of presidential primary elections or presidential preference elections allow the political parties to select their delegates to the national conventions that for president that happen over the summer. And they have cutoffs for when they need to have all the delegates in. And so for the Democrats, at least, that the cutoff was
فقط أن يكون لديهم كل المندوبين أو كل المفوضين. فكان عليهم أن يؤجلوا الانتخابات إلى أبعد حد ممكن ويقوموا بوضع جداول جديدة أو إعادة وضع جداول دون أن يكون هناك تأثير على الانتخابات النهائية للولايات. تنوع الانتخابات في الولايات المتحدة، هذا يعني أنه لا يوجد هناك شيء واحد أو حل واحد يناسب الجميع، أو كيف أن هذه الولاية عليها أن تستجيب للجائحة. فرأينا بعض الولايات يقومون بما في وسعهم مع الميزانية التي لديهم، أو مع حسب الموارد التي لديهم وحسب التشريعات أو الأطر التشريعية التي لديهم. أنتم جميعا تعملون في الانتخابات وأنتم تفهمون أن عملية التنفيذ تأخذ وقتا طويلا، ونحن لدينا فقط بضعة أشهر، لدينا 6 أشهر ربما. فالولايات تفكر كثيرا حول ما هي الخيارات التي لديهم بوجود مثل هذا الوقت الضيق. كل ولاية لديها التصويت الغيابي بحيث يستطيع المصوت أن يصوت، أو يستطيع الناخب أن يصوت إذا لم يكن قادرا على الوجود في مكان التصويت في يوم الانتخاب. هناك يعني قواعد مختلفة أو قوانين مختلفة. مثلا إذا ما قال شخص ما لا أستطيع أن أذهب في يوم الانتخاب، هناك أشخاص آخرين ربما في ولاية أخرى لديهم أعذار أخرى. فالجميع يحاول أن يفكروا بكرم أن يقدموا خيارات كريمة في مثل هذا الوضع. فنحن لا نعرف أين سنكون فيما يتعلق بقدرة مغادرة الناس منازل.
Sort of expanding access to mail ballots within the confine of what their existing regulation already is. In other states, we're seeing exclusive or moves to exclusively voting by mail. So the difference between absentee voting and voting by mail would be that in voting by mail, those ballots are proactively mailed to voters whether or not they request them. There are a few states in the US who already vote in that way. And we're seeing now, in light of the pandemic, a few states are moving that way, at least for elections before November. Again, all of this is made more complicated by the timelines for implementation. It takes a long time to procure equipment. It takes a long time to get vendors lined up who can print and mail and get everything set so that you're getting the right ballot to the right person. And then there are global supply chain challenges that are resulting from the pandemic. So shipping from overseas, for example, is slower, and understandably so. But when you have vendors who rely on equipment that is coming from Europe, and they can't guarantee necessarily that that equipment will be there by a certain date, that adds a layer of complexity. One other thing I'll note is that election officials here also have to deal with signature gathering and candidate qualification. In most states, that's how candidates qualify to be on the ballot, or how ballot issues qualify to be on the ballot is they get a certain number of signatures. And different states have different requirements for numbers and geographic dispersion of those signatures. But in a world now where you can't go door to door and knock on doors to get signatures, or you can't, stand on the street and ask people to sign your petition, states are trying to think through how candidates can still qualify for the ballot, because no one wants to limit access to candidates. So figuring out digital signature collection, and again, working within state constraints is hard, but is another piece of what states are working on. It's not realistic to suggest that there will be no in-person voting in the US in November. We can't move November. That's fixed. That's the one that can't move. But it's not realistic to assume that there won't be in-person options. We have to make elections secure, but they also have to be accessible for everyone. And it's not possible for every voter to hand mark a paper ballot at home. either for personal reasons, disability, things like that, but also the Postal Service doesn't serve every community as efficiently here. And so there will be in-person options. We have to make sure that those in-person options are safe from a health standpoint, and that election workers who are often volunteers and who historically have been in those vulnerable populations of, say, 60 to 65 plus, we have to make sure that they're safe. And so those are other things that election officials are thinking through. I think I'll stop there because I know Alice will give a very good overview of what DC is doing, but the takeaway I think should be that all of the states are trying to figure out what makes the most sense for them. There's just a lot of diversity in their different approaches and what they're allowed to do.
Thanks so much, Amy. Yeah, there really aren't easy answers or solutions that can fit every context. This is the same thing we face in the many countries UNDP operates, including in this region. Contexts are different, but it's good that you clarified there will be no changing to the presidential elections in the US in November. And they are looking at different options. You are at the forefront with your timeline of elections on different options. It would be really nice now when Alice explains what exactly and what the exact practical measures she is taking in Washington, DC. So thank you for that overview. I hope it was useful to our audience. I'm sure it was. I learned a lot. Before we get to Alice, we have one more speaker. He's a man with a very difficult job. His country is in the midst of a political crisis. He's president of the Election Commission during a time of transition. He was in the middle of election preparations when the pandemic broke out. He's been in the hot seat, as they say, having to make decisions on how to proceed, how to ensure all stakeholders are part of the decision-making process in his country, and how to balance public health and safety, the integrity of elections, and the politics around both. President Romero, we don't envy you, but we respect you and are grateful for your time today. Thank you for your intervention. Salvador, you can unmute yourself.
Hello, Nadia. Hello, everybody from La Paz, Bolivia. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Yes, we do.
Bolivia is a presidential republic in South America. And last year, Bolivia had a presidential election that was won by the incumbent, the President Evo Morales. However, the opposition didn't accept the results, neither a large group of citizens and even the international missions of observers. After 3 weeks of protests, Morales and his vice president resigned. In this complex political situation, a government was formed in charge to prepare a new presidential and legislative election. Also, a new electoral management body was possessed with the responsibility to organize this new election with a short time of preparation, only 120 days. The electoral tribunal, the Tribunal Supremo Electoral, like we said in Bolivia, is in charge of technical and jurisdictional work. We began in January and we decided that the voting day was going to be on May 3rd. We complete more than a half of the work and the electoral calendar when the government decreed the quarantine. With the suspension of these activities in the country, we had to suspend also the electoral calendar when 45 days were left for the election day, and we had to postpone the date. At this moment, we decided to organize meetings with the delegates of the candidates for the presidency to try to set a new date in a consensus spirit. We managed to establish an agreement for a bill with a range of dates for the election between June the 7th and September 6th. In this range, this is the idea of this project of bill, the Electoral Tribunal would choose a date considering scientific parameters of public health. We are now expecting that the Assembly will consider this bill this week. Now we can identify 4 challenges for this electoral process. The first is the legal and political one, when the Assembly will consider the bill that the Electoral Tribunal has submitted to the Assembly. The second challenge is the operational measures for our activities. How will we organize a process that it has to be safe for the population, for example, in the trainings and also in the electoral journey, and how can we assure the high turnout that Bolivia has traditionally in these elections. The third is which operational measures can we take for the electoral process abroad, because they don't depend, those countries, of the Electoral Tribunal of Bolivia, and how to assure also the coming of the electoral observation missions in Bolivia. And the fourth challenge is how will be the impact of the economic change in the election. I want to say maybe we will have a cost that will be more than we planned. So we will need probably more money that we planned at the beginning of the electoral process. These are the 4 challenges that has the Electoral Tribunal of Bolivia preparing this presidential and legislative.
المحكمة الانتخابية من أجل تشريع هذه الانتخابات. شكرا لكم.
Thank you very much, Salvador. A lot of questions around safety measures, what exactly you will do. I think you were in a difficult position around the politics, but now you have a period of where you actually have to put in some measures. We will have a conversation during the Q&A to address some of the questions that are coming in. Please, again, to send your questions, your comments in the chat box. We'll get to it during the Q&A. We had around 199, almost 200 people, so you're reaching a large audience. I will now introduce our last speaker so that we can get to the Q&A and get to your questions. As I mentioned, Washington, D.C. Is represented today by Alice Miller. She's in the midst of a heavy period of election preparations. She's really taken time out of a very busy period for herself to be here. She's heading the election board in Washington, the heart of politics in the US. She has extensive experience in elections, has served in numerous capacities, as you can see from her CV. We are very happy to have you here, Alice. Please share some of the practical measures you're taking for voters in DC. How's the pandemic affecting you, your staff, what would you like to share from that experience with a global audience and with your EMB peers from around the world? Thank you, Ellen.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. As Naja said, I'm Alice Miller, the Executive Director for the DC Board of Elections. I want to first thank Amy. She did an excellent job with giving an overview of how we operate as an entity of state election directors in the United States, indicating that there is no one fix all and there is no federal or oversight where we are guided and driven by what everyone has to do. Every state and jurisdiction operates on its own. So in the District of Columbia, for purposes of elections, we are considered a state. And that means that we have all the responsibilities and all the requirements that any other state must fulfill with respect to elections. Currently, we have about 500,000 voters that we will be trying to service for this upcoming primary, which is set for June 2nd. So we're about a month or so out from a major primary election, and we will have another election immediately following that, a special election. And with that in mind, I will tell you that it has been a real challenge trying to figure out how we're going to conduct this election. Normally we have 144 precincts that we operate for our poll workers. This go around, we will have, we're not gonna do our normal 144 precincts. What we are planning to do is have 20 vote centers. That will be 20 operating entities where anybody can go to any of those vote centers on election day and vote their ballot. But in the interim, what we are doing is doing a major push to have voters request their mail ballot. And as Amy indicated, it's a little different absentee ballot versus an all-mail ballot election. We're not doing an all-mail ballot election because we were not set up for that. That is a process that takes many years and major implementation to try to put in place, and we just were not prepared for that in the short period of time that we had. So we have started to ask voters to provide us with the information that they would like to request a mail ballot, and we will respond to mail as opposed to pushing mail out. A little different process, but in large part, a lot of mail ballots, none the same. Challenges that we were facing, which led us to that with this pandemic, was one of the main things is being able to recruit the necessary poll workers that we would need to operate 144 precincts in the District of Columbia. Many of our poll workers fall within the at-risk category in terms of age, and we were hearing early on when this first broke out that they were not interested or were not going to be able to assist us as poll workers. So with that in mind, we then had to look to what was going to be, again, the next best thing. So the poll worker recruitment was an issue. We normally have 3,000 poll workers or more that we have set aside for the elections to staff the precincts. We have gone from 3,000 to about 500 to staff the 20 vote centers. And honestly, we're having a problem trying to secure 500 workers in light of the virus. So we are about confirmed with 300 right now. We have a couple more weeks to get another few hundred in place, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. The other challenge with that is that we always have to, of course, train our workers. And normally our poll worker training is in person. This has also created a problem because we cannot have large gatherings, and that would be considered a large gathering to be training poll workers. So we've started training them remotely to prepare them to prepare to operate the vote centers. And the remote training is, as you could have probably imagined, a bit of a challenge for many of our seniors and many of our older workers. So that again limits the availability of individuals being able to participate as a worker in the election. but we've got what we've got, and we're working with what we're working with, and hopefully, as I said, we'll be able to have enough workers to staff the election. So with the mail balloting, we have already to date received about 17 or 18,000 requests for mail ballots. We've got a long ways to go. We'll accept mail ballots requests up until a week before the election, and we will count ballots that come in as long as they are postmarked or otherwise having been received by our office on election day. We will receive them up to 7 days after the election, but they have to have been postmarked by election day, which is June 2nd. So if they don't get back to us by June 2nd, that's okay. As long as we can show that they have been voted by June 2nd with a postmark or otherwise dropped off at one of our vote centers, which is a possibility, we will indeed count them as valid for that election. We have also one of the things I want to talk about is accessibility, which Amy also mentioned, which requires, in our mind, the reason for us to set up the vote centers. We didn't want to just do all mail balloting without any availability for someone to physically show up and vote, because there are many individuals that are not able to vote by mail. And so we have the 20 centers which have accessibility equipment and accessibility in terms of language translation and things of that nature. So voters will be able to take advantage of that if necessary. One of the things that we will do is supply the personal protective equipment, just in terms of face masks, hand sanitizers, and we'll have someone clean the screens off. The other things we're going to do before anyone is allowed into the precinct, we will scan their foreheads to make sure that they do not have a high-grade temperature or low-grade temperature. If they have a temperature and they are there to vote, we will request that they vote from their car, which we call curbside voting, and we will bring the ballot out to them and have them vote from the curb, as opposed to allowing them into the precinct and thereby exposing more people to what may or may be the virus or a problem in themselves as well. So we're taking all kinds of precautions for this. It's going okay right now. I can tell you that a lot of our seniors are not very, very happy. They would like for us to set up a vote center, so to speak, within their residential communities, which we're actually not able to do in short notice without planning and technology to do it with. So the centers will be accessible. The ballots are, will be mailed out on request. One of the things that we're doing to try to help our senior residents is to send them a request. You have to request a mail ballot. So we will send them the request. In all of the senior residents where individuals live, which we have that information, we're preloading the document. All they have to do is sign and mail it back. All the information will be loaded on the application. We're doing that through technology. And then all they have to do literally is mail that back to us. And then we will mail them their ballot. As Amy says, this is not a one-size-fits-all. We're trying to work in many different elements with many different challenges. I've had staff that has been sick. I've had staff that has been exposed by members of the public to the to individuals who have had the virus, and they have indicated that to us. And we've had to close our actual office down for trying to avoid against that, so that we can get the work done with as many healthy folks as possible. One of the things that we have not yet gotten an answer to, which is another issue that Amy mentioned, and that is our nominating petition process for the November election. We are still facing our primary. So with the November election, candidates still need to figure out how they're going to gain access to the ballot. And normally, as was indicated, they circulate petitions and they're going door to door to get signatures in order to support their candidacy. We are working now with our legislative body to try to figure out how that's going to work. We were on a call with them yesterday, but as of now, there is no answer for that. We need to figure that out. It is a big question. It is one that individuals are concerned about. One particular contest, for example, they require a minimum of 3,000 signatures, and candidates always file double that amount to ensure that they have enough and that they aren't just getting signatures of individuals who are not qualified to sign and support their candidacy. So not having the ability to go door to door and freely collect those signatures does put a burden on any candidate interested in running for the election, and that is yet a hurdle that has to be accomplished. So that's about it in the short realm. I'm going to hang around for a few minutes. I do have another meeting that I have to get to in about 10 minutes, so I'm available. If anybody comes up with something after I'm gone, please feel free to send me an email or work through Naja, and we'll certainly get that responded to for you. But I'm here for a minute. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. I don't know how you sleep. There's so many issues to manage and so many little details to work out, but these are very nice practical measures that you're taking. I think they will be useful to a lot of our audience. There's already a question that I will already give to you since you have to go, is on the remote training. There's a lot of interest. Could you elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. We have our staff is actually doing the training. And what we have done is reach out to the poll workers who we have already in our in our system to see if they are first interested in working the election, because we know there's been a lot of individuals who are not because of the virus, and then to determine if they have access to log on remotely through our training avenue. And so once we do that, we use a prepared PowerPoint that we would use normally in class had they been there, but instead we're doing it remotely. So it's not the best way to do it, because we like to do hands-on with a lot of the equipment and some of the nuances that we have, but it's the best thing that we could do for this election. It's working. We can see who sits around, who leaves, who stays, because we asked them to turn the video on, obviously. And so they're getting used to it. We'll see how it plays out once they're actually in the vote center on election day, or through that. Let me just say this: our vote centers will operate for, I didn't say this, for 10 days. We will start on May 22nd and go through June 1st, and then election day, June 2nd. Everything will be open a total of 11 full days. Normally, we have vote centers only open for a week. So we will see, obviously, as they're in there more, they'll become more comfortable with what they're doing. But because we're pushing the mail ballot request, we're really, truly hoping that we don't have a lot of our voters in. We will also do the social distancing in our precincts, where there will be a 6-foot distance between each voter, and no more than 10 voters allowed in the vote center at a time.
Fantastic, thank you. I know there's going to be a lot of glitches along the way, but we're all learning as we go, including us on this webinar, including all of us who are working remotely in our own field. So thank you very much for giving us an insight into what you're doing in Washington, D.C. It's really fantastic work. Now we'll move over to our Q&A session. I'll ask Osama if you want to one more time mention the translation very quickly.
Yes, Nadia. ممكن تكون الأخيرة للحصول على الترجمة العربية. خليني بس أشير السكرين تبعتي. تمام. ممتاز. الحصول على الترجمة العربية في لوحة التحكم اللي تحت موجود مربع أسود أو مستطيل أسود كبير في جوا ايكونز لكرة أرضية هنا بأشر عليها. اضغط عليها رح يطلع عندكم المنيو هاي الموجودة بالصورة، فيها مجموعة من اللغات المختلفة، انجلش، فرنش واوف. إذا بتحب تسمع اللغة الأصلية للحديث الأصلي خليها اوف مثل ما هي. إذا بتحب تسمع الترجمة العربية اضغط على فرنش، واضغط أيضاً على ميوت أوريجينال أوديو لكتم الصوت المتحدث الأصلي وسماع الترجمة فقط. شكراً.
Thank you, Ama. So we have a number of questions. I will start with a few that are general and pass it over to certain speakers. And Alice, I know you have to go, so I will focus on you at the beginning. One of the questions is really on personal data and protection of personal data. What measures are you taking, especially if you're introducing technology, if you're introducing postal voting? What measures are being taken in the US to ensure the safety and protection of personal data? This goes to you, Alice and Amy.
Well, the personal data is actually in the United States. Anyone who's registered to vote, their name and address and a political party is public information. So that is, anyone can get that information as long as they are a registered voter. The only thing that we do not have access to is their social security number and date of birth. And so our elections will operate as they always have without that information being made available. But all other information is public information for anyone that is on our voter registry on request.
I would also add that election officials here are not taking cybersecurity less seriously now that we're also focusing on the response to COVID-19. So everything that we're doing is with a security lens behind it. So Alice's point about voter registration list is a good one. But with, you know, protecting databases and protecting equipment, all of the same security lessons are being applied.
President Salvador, do you have anything to add on how your commission is ensuring the security of personal data? You may have to unmute yourself. You're mute. Salvador, you're mute. Maybe I can unmute you here. Okay, you're unmute now. No, I'm still mute.
Now?
Yes, good.
Okay. Yes, we are. We have to reflect on these issues, and we have to reflect also on health security measures for the electoral personnel, the staff, and the voters. And we are attentive to what is being done in other countries, as well as the recommendation of the national and international health institutions. Furthermore, in the case of Bolivia, we also must consider the technical and economic variables when we make decisions. There are decisions who can be made more easily in developed countries than in more or less developed countries, and this is an important variable for Bolivia.
I was mute. I think an important issue that keeps coming up in the questions to myself and in the chat, in the broader group, is on youth engagement. How can we use this opportunity to engage the segment of the population that is a lot more savvy with technology, that is really taking political participation online? What electoral authorities can and are doing to engage them into the process. I will ask Hisham if he can speak to this first.
Well, listen, I mean, listening to the speakers and looking at the, interventions by the 172 people joining us, I think we should take the lead as electoral management bodies, because let me talk about my case in my country, and I think to a large extent reflect the rest of the members, that we lost connection whatsoever. Forget about the management itself, but the electoral management with the stakeholders. Because if you want to preserve the democratic process, despite the pandemic, effect, then you have to reconnect with the stakeholders. I mean, you have to make or start playing the role of catalyst, in motivating political parties to engage electronically, at least use technology in not hiding within, in their homes or offices and surrendering that, okay, and getting the easy way answer, let's postpone or let's, forget about election. Who cares about election this year? Everybody is, no, we have to work as the agency that motivate the democratic, circle within a given country. So I'm talking about things that, come to my mind right now, and this is a good thing that come out of this session. Without this session, maybe I haven't been able to think about such idea. And then again, with our stakeholders, civil society organization, observation groups. I thought about a new stake of health. I mean, let's talk with Minister of Health. I would explain our normal procedure in a given electoral event, and listen to their recommendation on how to conduct such operation, what their recommendation in terms of the design of the polling station, for example, in terms of, for example, you need to, why do we have to do election in one day? You can do it in 2 days, for example. You have, or spread the, what I mean is how to create that cope with the pandemic and at the same time keep the democratic, process going on, and not giving a way for existing regimes or government or whatever political parties to take it or to take that as an excuse and stay in power for years to come. I hope the pandemic will not stay for years to come.
Amen to that. Maybe I'll ask Amy if you can share any innovative ways that states are reaching out to engage youth in the broader process and in elections themselves. I know the dynamic is different between the Arab region and the US, but there's been a lot of apathy among young voters in the US as well. Maybe you can share with us.
Yeah, so the COVID-19 actually presents some unique opportunities for engaging with young voters. Poll workers, like Alice mentioned, are a huge challenge for states across the country and election workers, especially given that many election workers tend to be in the most vulnerable categories. But so one way that states are engaging with young people is by encouraging young people who are home, because now colleges and universities are closed, encouraging those people to serve as election workers, to serve in that way. That is sort of unique to the situation that we're in. Often college students or university students remain registered to vote in their home state and don't register where they go to school. So that's a good opportunity for those younger people to engage in the process in a different way. Presidential election years for us always represent a year where young people are sort of more targeted, and November elections in presidential years are usually the times when the most infrequent voters vote. So there are a lot of groups who are doing voter registration efforts and working to engage with young people in that way, to engage them and encourage them to be voters. But But like I said, the pandemic presents some unique opportunities for them to get engaged in their home communities in ways that they wouldn't necessarily be able to have been able to previously. Also, they have more time on their hands, which is helpful for election officials who need poll workers to staff longer term vote centers and things like that. They are more technologically savvy often, so that's helpful too.
Perfect, thanks. There are a lot of questions coming in. We'll try to get to most of them. I know the time is also short. There's a question in particular, maybe I can pass this to Rafael, a discussion on sort of the impacts on democracy and where things are politically. How do you see, or how does the public know whether policies are going in the right direction or in the wrong direction in terms of civic space, political space? Are there any pre-existing conditions that can affect the overall outcome post-pandemic?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think this all will depend very much on the kind of political conflict in the country. For example, in most stable democracies, a general election will just decide who will be in government. That's not the main question. I mean, we are talking about the renovation of government, or just the continuity of the government in place, the incumbent in place, because the popular will has decided to get the incumbent in place. But then this is not the case in most of the countries of the world. In those countries going through crisis, specific political crisis of the time, of the moment, the political impact of the elections might be very big. It might be very negative if there is no some basic agreement beforehand, before the elections, between the political contenders. Because we are not talking of just replacing a government, we are going further than that. It's the regime which is at stake. Contrarily, in situations of stability, as I said, you know, the alternancy in government is the issue, and then maybe the overall effects of elections with problems, because all elections under COVID-19 are elections under special circumstances, and therefore with specific problems, which many of them might have not been anticipated. I had a question at the beginning of that you sent me in the chat, asking about the participation, for example, political participation. Then if we look at the experience of the last 3 months, we can see that participation has varied depending on countries. For example, in Germany, in Bavaria, in southern Germany, regional elections, and in South Korea last week. And I had a question on South Korea. On South Korea last week, participation was, in Germany, was normal. I mean, it didn't move from the average from previous elections. In South Korea, it was even higher than in the last 20 years, although it was 66%. So always the participation percentages that do not tell us much unless we compare with the previous election. Okay, Salvador was talking about Bolivia. Bolivia is a country with the highest, I think, in Latin America. Voter turnout is over 80%. So this is, the situation would be different. The impact of an election on that particular variable is uncertain. But in these 2 cases, for example, it was clear. Contrarily, in France and Mali, in France, there were municipal elections, regional municipal elections. The first round election was much lower than previous election. Then, for different reasons, not only that.
Just a couple of minutes, please.
Yes, okay. And then, contrarily, in Mali, election was very low, 3 weeks ago, etc. So we have these two kind of impacts, which the impact on participation might not be as important unless there is intentions disenfranchisement. Is not as important as the effect on the whole, on the overall political conflict in the country, the political lines, cleavages in the country. And this is uncertain. We don't know. I mean, it depends on countries.
Thanks, Rafael. I'm just reading the last comment, which is the recommendation to give more time to question and answers. And I totally agree, because this is the best part, but we're coming sort of to the end. And I feel very, very bad, because I actually want to hear answers to these questions. I'm going to give time, 2 minutes to each speaker. I know they've been following the chat as well. Please do some closing remarks. Try to address some of the questions. Some of them relate to how are you engaging, for instance, health workers? This is a health pandemic. Are you bringing in health experts or not in your decision-making processes? There's questions around e-voting. Does the pandemic present an opportunity to re-evaluate whether e-voting is good or bad now that we will rely heavily on technology? Should be weighing more towards having e-voting or not? There are questions on gender. Are you having any special measures to ensure that women have access to the process, both in terms of administration and in voting? There are questions on, Rafael, how your assessment will use data. There's a 1-week time frame. Is that reasonable? So these are the type of questions coming in, and a lot more. I'm so sorry, I really can't take all of them, but we will continue this conversation in 2 weeks. And I will, we lost Alice, I think, so I'll give it to Amy first.
Well, thank you again for having me. It's very interesting, and I'm particularly interested. I saw in the chat that the gentleman from South Korea said that their report will be coming out soon in English, and I know that both myself and my colleagues here are looking forward to that, because I think there's a lot that we can learn. I guess I'll swing at the e-voting one. NASA doesn't have a position on that in particular. But the thing is, the thing that all states are considering, as I mentioned, is balancing security with the new reality. Many of you are in countries where the Postal Service is not running, or where your borders are closed to travel from outside. That impacts our voters, US voters who are living overseas. And so, you know, every state is considering their options and has to manage the risk for themselves, but it's certainly a thing that that we're considering. That when people are looking at the menu of options, that's certainly something that they think about, but that's a thing that they need to consider for themselves. It will be interesting to see how the next few months go here. Send your best thoughts and wishes to those of us here in the US, because we have a marathon yet to go between now and November, and dozens, if not hundreds, of elections that need to be executed. So thank you again for having me, and please feel free to reach out to me directly to discuss specific questions.
Thank you so much, Amy. Yeah, we are following developments in the US very closely. You have your hands full, so we do wish you luck, and thank you for offering yourself to answer questions. We will continue this conversation on our Twitter page. Please follow us, and also RBMB's Facebook page. I will now ask President Salvador Romero to make his closing remarks and maybe address some of the questions that did come in. You'll have to unmute yourself. Okay, there we go. Good.
Okay, thank you. Just one reflection about new technology. It's important to consider that when you are weeks before an election, there are no many possibilities to introduce new technologies for the electoral process. You have normally a legal framework to do the election. But beyond this point, it's important to consider the political context of each election. And in all, I think it's important to do the effort to generate a consensus spirit between the political parties and the candidates. But there are also differences between if you are running a local or a presidential or a general election. Is more difficult, is huge when you are running a presidential or a general election that has been that you have to postpone it. And there is also difference in context between countries who has strong or weak institutions. There is also a very important difference. And also there are difference if the country is in a situation of some kind of political crisis, or there is a normal political situation. The impact of postpone the election is not the same. So I think we have to reflect on the technical issues, but also in the political issues to see how is the impact of postpone an election.
Thank you, President. Those are important considerations. And I also want to thank our global experts who have been commenting and contributing to questions on the chat. Much appreciated. I will now ask Hisham if he can do some closing remarks. There were a couple of questions directed to the Arab states, one in particular on whether the survey that included the lockdown on women staff, gender considerations taken into account in the survey itself, and then how Arab UNBs are responding to the pandemic. Thanks, Hisham. Hisham, can you unmute yourself, please?
Just 3 quick points. I mean, I believe we have to invest firmly in ICT, creating ICT capacity to deal with everything, not only communicating between staffing, but also with all stakeholders. I won't advise rushing, into thinking of e-voting, because think about cost, think about the amount of trainings, think about the legislation that you have to change, think about you can't do e-voting in contested, political situation or environment like we have. The second, I would see that now there is an urgent need to have a sort of forum of executive offices or officers within the Arab UNB, and to have regular meeting, weekly meeting, to share ideas and discuss option to present and to be hosted by Arab UNB. The last point, I would urge UNDP continue this kind of seminars upon agreed upon topic, so we can and select speakers. And this way we can learn from each other. And as I agree with you, we look forward to see the American elections happening, so we can learn on the ground. Apart from the e-voting and post-voting, we need to see what happened on the ground. Thank you.
Thanks, Hisham. There was also a suggestion to compile the experiences of those countries that have already taken place. I think this is something we'll take on board. There was a lot of reference to what happened in South Korea. So yeah, there are examples out there that we can start to look at already. And of course, we will be looking to the US elections as well. Now, pass to Rafael and ask him to be brief as well. I mean, in terms of questions, there are the broader questions of how do you ensure electoral justice in this environment, especially when we're heavily relying on technology. And as we know, not everyone can access and use technology. Any comments you can have on that and your closing remarks. And any last takeaways, Rafael, that you would like sort of the global community to keep in mind?
Thank you very much. Yeah, there is. It was apparent from our discussions here, that the list of issues which have to be reset or to re-question is huge. I mean, practically, we go over the entire electoral process, not only the process, but also the entire electoral cycle and how this would impact and be impacted by the pandemic, by the economy, by the government, etc. So to me, the most important, if I have to get a single conclusion of this workshop today, is actually on the necessity exactly of this kind of exercise, where we can, each of us might have his or her own model of in the organization, work organizations, to assessing the situation in the country or countries where they are working. But the important thing is that we start inputting elements, variables, or constant elements, and then we manage looking at the examples of other countries where they are having or postponing or canceling elections, etc., filling a given model. Because this is the way we can come out with some practical conclusions and then design. Because if this COVID is going to be with us, as it seems it will, for several years, I don't think that the world is going to postpone elections for several years. This year might be maybe around 100 elections around the world. Some of them might be dispensable. Most preoccupation of people is not on election these days, of course, it's normal. But then election will come, and will have to come if we want to preserve a weakened democratic systems that we have these days, because as we all know, in the last few years, the rights and liberties and democratic solidity has been undermined by a number of factors, economic, social, and political. So my main conclusion is this: let's continue with these exercises. Let's exchange information. Let's look at comparative experience, and this will be giving us ideas on each of the main elements included in the electoral undertaking. On this electoral justice, you mentioned this at the beginning. I mean, that's fine, but this is one of those questions where we have to start from the beginning to the end of a process and starting watching, is there any impact of what is going on the equality of access to justice, on the fairness of decisions made by adjudication bodies, etc., etc. So I wish for the best on these exercises, and thank you very much again.
Thank you, Rafael, but you depressed me when you said this can continue for years, the virus.
That's what they say, what the researchers say, that the virus itself will continue. We have to learn, like we have learned about other flu-related viruses, and because we have,
it's a new normal. This new normal will continue. So
but this is new and more deadly. Is new and more deadly. So because it is easily to get infected, but this is a fact. We have to deal with it.
Thank you very much, Rafael. Thank you again to all the speakers who took time. Alice left us, the rest of you, we really appreciate your time. And of course, all the participants, and particularly your contributions to the chat. UNDP is working with many of you and many other governments. So these options that you are sharing, the examples and the questions are really going to complement the work the UN system as a whole is doing in terms of supporting in the response to COVID on these issues in particular. I'm very happy. This was a very rich conversation. I hope it was useful to all of you. The comments have been very positive. So we'll take the recommendations as well into account, including to expanding the Q&A session a bit longer, because this really is the meat of the conversation. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will do this every 2 weeks. This was just a pilot. It's the first session, so it's a broad conversation about different experiences. We're looking to do the next one on a specific theme. Some of you have suggested topics. We'll take those into account. You're particularly interested on getting specific ideas on distance voting, postal voting, ways of making sure the election can take place this year or next year if the pandemic is going to go beyond. Please do follow us on Twitter. We will be sharing further information, including sort of examples and options from other countries on social media to inform decision-making of EMVs, including those that are here today. As I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar will be available offline, the recording of it. We will share the link with you on social media, Facebook, Twitter, on our UNDP website. We really appreciate having you again. We hope this has been a good platform. Thank you again to the speakers, to all the participants. We hope to see you in 2 weeks' time. Stay safe, stay at home. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Ciao.
Thank you, Rafael.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, guys.
Safe rest of the day. Ciao.
Dr. Ahmad, I see you. I know you wanted to speak. I'm so sorry. We will try a different format for the next session so we can have more